Combo! All right. Hello, everybody. It is 10 a.m. and we're ready to get started. So let's go ahead and switch over to the live view. Here we go. This is the syllabus, the schedule at the end of the syllabus again. We are, hold on. Okay. Got an emergency alert, but it was just a test. Anyway, uh, so here we are. We have just completed last week the exam 2. Today is the last day to complete the lab midterm. It's not terribly difficult, the lab midterm. It comes from the labs you've already completed, so if you haven't done it already, please get that in. Uh, so last week we moved into the respiratory system. Wait, is today the last day for the midterm? I'm not sure on that. If you haven't finished the midterm, get it in. If you're having trouble with it, email me. I thought the due date was today, but maybe it was last Tuesday. Either way, the respiratory system we started last week, we covered it in part 1 and part 2. Today in part 3, we will finish the respiratory system and then move into digestive system part 1. Thursday, we will cover the digestive system part 2, and we might have to do a part 3 on the week of the 24th. Next week is spring break, so we won't be doing anything. Um, Go ahead, take a week off, relax, try and stay away from COVID-19. Um, yeah, all right. I'd love to talk to you guys about COVID-19, but I don't think we have time for it. Anyway, moving on, let's jump into today's lecture. So, I said I wanted to put off the charts that we have to look at, the hemoglobin saturation charts, and the reason for that is that charts in general really deserve a lot of attention because they visually represent really big ideas. And so if you can understand a chart thoroughly, then you really understand the concept. All right, so let's look at the hemoglobin saturation curve. So what do we have on the x-axis? That's the partial pressure of oxygen. And what do we have on the y-axis? That's the percent saturation of the hemoglobin. So, what percentage of the total hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen, right? Because some of it will have oxygen bound to it, some of it might not, right? Each hemoglobin can bind 4 oxygen molecules. All right, so here's 100%, that's the maximum possible. All right, down here's 0, minimum possible percent saturation for hemoglobin. At a partial pressure of 0 oxygen, right, we're going to have 0% saturation of hemoglobin. That seems obvious, right? If there's no oxygen, if there's 0 oxygen in the blood, then there will be 0 oxygen bound to hemoglobin. Now, as we increase the partial pressure of oxygen, you will see the percent saturation of hemoglobin go up. All right. Now, it's not linear, this relationship. If it were linear, that would mean for every step up in partial pressure of oxygen, we would see a step up in the percent saturation of hemoglobin. It's not linear because um, some of it is dissolved in the blood plasma. All right. Yeah, and then we have other factors such as CO2 to consider. But anyway, just generally to simplify it a bit, we do see an increase in the percent saturation of hemoglobin as partial pressure of oxygen increases. Okay. As we reach, what is it, about 90 millimeters mercury for the partial pressure of oxygen, we see an almost 100% saturation of hemoglobin. Now, do you guys remember what the partial pressure of oxygen is typically in blood, or rather, we should say, um, in the pulmonary veins as we're moving away from the lungs? Okay, that's about 104 millimeters mercury. Okay, so at 90, we're pretty close to 100%. 104 millimeters mercury. All right, that's where we are leaving the lungs. When we return from the tissues, we're going to be in the area of about 70 millimeters mercury. Okay, and so we're still going to be at about 95% saturation for hemoglobin. Okay. Doesn't usually get much lower than this unless you are hypoxic. If you are breathing normally and you're getting oxygen to the blood, you should stay in this range from the uh, pulmonary veins at about 104 to the pulmonary arteries at about 70. Okay. And this is one of the reasons you don't pass out immediately when you hold your breath. If the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood and the percent saturation of hemoglobin plummeted, all right, if this curve plummeted, um, then you would pass out. But because the percent saturation of hemoglobin remains high, even as we slightly decrease the partial pressure of oxygen, you still have plenty of oxygen to use. All right, so the partial pressure differences cause the oxygen to diffuse from the alveolus into the blood. Okay. Oh, hmm, I was wrong. Not 70, it's about 40 millimeters mercury in the pulmonary arteries. Okay, coming from the right side of the heart to the lungs, the deoxygenated blood is about 40 millimeters mercury. So let's go back and look at this curve. That's the number I memorized. Okay, we're at about 75% saturation when we're at 40 millimeters mercury. I'm sorry, that was my mistake. 75% saturation at 40 millimeters mercury. Anyway, at 40 millimeters mercury, in the pulmonary arteries, moving from the right side of the heart to the lungs, where blood is most deoxygenated, right? Um, this is the lowest oxygen concentration in the body, blood returning to the lungs. Okay. We're going to see oxygen move from an area of high partial pressure, that's 104 millimeters mercury in the alveolus, into the capillaries where it's about 40 millimeters mercury. Okay. And now at the venous end of the pulmonary capillaries, partial pressure is going to be about 104 millimeters mercury. All right, so back up to normal. Then as we travel through the tissues, we're going to drop to 95 and then down to, again, 40 millimeters mercury at the tissues and return to the pulmonary arteries. Okay, so oxygen moves, again, from high partial pressure areas to low partial pressure areas, from 104 millimeters mercury into the 40 millimeters mercury area in the capillaries. Then down at the tissues, you see that the tissues have a partial pressure of about 40 millimeters mercury. Blood entering the capillaries and the tissues is about 95 millimeters mercury. It's about 40 millimeters mercury in the tissue. And so oxygen will diffuse out of the blood capillaries into the tissues until they equilibrate over here at the venous end at about 40 millimeters mercury. Blood returns through the right side of the heart to the lungs, and it has about 40 millimeters mercury, partial pressure of oxygen. All right, so the oxyhemoglobin dissociation charts we see here show that as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases, so does the amount of oxygen released from hemoglobin. The reason for that is that carbon dioxide is competing with oxygen for binding sites on hemoglobin. And in fact, carbon dioxide actually binds a little bit better than oxygen. So as carbon dioxide comes into the blood cell, it's going to bind the hemoglobin and push oxygen out. Okay. Okay, and so down here we've got again the partial pressure of oxygen and the percent saturation of hemoglobin, but we've got three curves that show what happens at 20 millimeters mercury, 40, and 80 millimeters mercury. Okay, and so for carbon dioxide, that is. So about 40 is average, and so at 40 millimeters mercury, we're going to see again. Okay, right here's 40 millimeters of PO2, partial pressure of oxygen. That comes to about 75% hemoglobin binding. Now, what if we decrease the partial pressure of CO2? What if we have less CO2 in the blood, right? Well, we're going to shift the curve left, and so we can look again. All right, at 75% oxygen binding, that's going to occur at 30 millimeters mercury. And so what that means is that now we see the 75% saturation mark at 30 millimeters mercury instead of 40 for oxygen. All right, so when CO2 is low, we are more able to bind oxygen to hemoglobin. Okay, this curve becomes more steep. All right, and so in other words, oxygen binds hemoglobin better when CO2 concentrations are lower. Now we look over here, we jump from 40 to 80 millimeters mercury for CO2. At 80 millimeters mercury for CO2, okay, let's go ahead and look at that same position, 75% oxygen binding. That's going to meet us right about here at 55 millimeters mercury for oxygen. Okay, and so, all right, what this means is that hemoglobin again is going to be far less able to bind oxygen in the condition of elevated CO2. When CO2 is elevated, okay, it's going to take a lot more oxygen in the blood to meet this mark of 75% saturation. Okay. When CO2 is low, it takes less oxygen in the blood to meet this mark of 75% CO2. The long and short of it is that, again, low CO2 makes it easier to bind oxygen. High CO2 makes it difficult to bind oxygen. And both conditions actually are not ideal. We want to be, of course, why? Because when the blood reaches the tissues, we actually want it to be pretty easy for oxygen to dissociate, to let go of hemoglobin. When the blood reaches the tissues, we want to be able to release the oxygen. All right, so that's why low CO2 is bad. High CO2 obviously reduces the carrying capacity of the blood and of the hemoglobin for oxygen. Now we can look here too. pH is going to also affect the shape of hemoglobin and make it less able to hold on to oxygen. So blood pH is around 7.4. Okay, so that's normal here in the center. And we can see that again. You look over 75% saturation, carry it down. We've got about 40 millimeters mercury. You can see this is the same curve we've been looking at in the center here. Okay. Now, if we increase the pH and make it more basic or alkaline, okay, you're going to see that, all right, 75% mark, carry it over. We see that at around, again, 30 millimeters mercury. So as we increase the pH and make the blood more basic, hemoglobin is better able to hold on to oxygen. However, that's not necessarily a good thing because we need to release oxygen when hemoglobin gets to the blood capillaries, to the tissues. Same thing over here. If someone is acidotic and their blood pH lowers to 7.2, becomes more acidic, you're going to see that it becomes more difficult to hold on to oxygen. Okay, so it'll take a greater concentration of oxygen in the blood to reach the same percentage of saturation of the hemoglobin. Or one more way we could look at this. One more way we could look at this is if you want to look at, let's look right here. At 40 millimeters mercury, what is the saturation of hemoglobin? Okay, at 40 millimeters mercury, which is the normal partial pressure of oxygen as we leave the tissues. All right, how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin? Under normal conditions, that's right here at about 75%. Under acidotic conditions, it's going to be down here at about 55%. And under alkaline or alkalotic conditions, that's going to be up here at about 85%. Okay. The middle curve we would say is physiological. This is the normal homeostatic set point. This is what we want to reach. The other two conditions are pathological. So we can see also that temperature affects the dissociation of oxygen. Okay, temperature affects protein shape, and protein shape affects body temperature is around 38 degrees Celsius. Most textbooks will tell you 37, but it's around 38%. And actually, there have been recent studies which tell us that the human body temperature is actually lower um, than previously thought. And so let's go ahead and do this. Let's do some math, right? Who doesn't love math, especially doing it live and on the fly? All right, so they always tell you what's human body temperature in Fahrenheit, 98.6 degrees. Of course, this is an average taken from hundreds of individuals. Um, everybody's a little bit different, but this was an average taken about 200 years ago. 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is the number we get. So we convert that to metric, minus 32 degrees, and then divide that by, I could be wrong, but 2.2 degrees, I think. I think I'm wrong. Let's go ahead and look up how to do that. Convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. 5/9, whatever 5/9 is. Okay, so 98.6 minus 32, and then divided by 5/9. Nope. 0.6 times 5/9. It's not right either. Oh, yes, it is. Sorry. 37. Yes, 37. Okay. What are we trying to figure out? I've already forgotten. I hate doing math live in front of people. All right. Now, what they've actually found is that human body temperature in the last 200 years, on average, has dropped. And so the average now is somewhere in the area of 97 degrees. So if we go ahead and subtract that, minus 32 divided by 5/9, that was, no, it's 65 times 5/9. Gosh, that's about 36.1. All right. So average body temperature now is somewhere between 36 and 37 degrees. So we really in this area up here. All right, back to the curve here. Let's go ahead and use the 38 degrees Celsius curve because that's the one they give us. This is pretty close to physiologic conditions. All right, this is how things should look. If we increase the body temperature to 43 degrees Celsius, you are going to see that it becomes more difficult to hold on to oxygen. And if we decrease the body temperature to 30, 20, 10, or even 0 degrees Celsius, you'll see that it becomes far more difficult to let go of oxygen. All right, 43 degrees Celsius. We're getting good at this math thing, so let's go ahead and try that again. 43, now this time it will be divided by 5/9. Gives us what? No, that's not right. 43 divided by 5 divided by 9. 77.4 plus 32 degrees gives us 109.4. So in Fahrenheit, that's what we're looking at here. This curve, 109.4. Of course, you know, people can't live very long at temperatures this high, over 105 really. We get into the seriously fatal range. Let's go ahead and do 30 degrees. So 30 divided by 5 divided by 9. 54 plus 32. This 30-degree curve would be 86 degrees, which is a temperature at which humans also cannot live. We cannot live with a core temperature of 86. So um, these have to be done under lab conditions, really. These tests were done under lab conditions. Humans can't live in that range. All right, so cellular metabolism, we've mentioned, generates CO2. CO2 is generated in the tissues, and so they are the source of CO2. It's going to diffuse into the capillaries because the tissues will have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide than the capillaries do. All right. The carbon dioxide is transported to the lungs in three ways. It can be dissolved in the plasma. Not a lot of it can be dissolved in the plasma. There's a limit to how much we can dissolve in the plasma. It can also be bound to hemoglobin, forming a molecule called carbaminohemoglobin. And this just means that there's carbon dioxide bound to hemoglobin. We can form similar words with oxygen, by the way. We can call it oxyhemoglobin if there's oxygen bound to it. All right, so it can also be carried through the blood in the form of a bicarbonate ion. So we've talked about this before. CO2 plus water makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can release a hydrogen ion, and then the resulting molecule is bicarbonate. And because it's negatively charged, you could call it a bicarbonate ion. Now, this reaction is perfectly reversible. If you add a hydrogen back to bicarbonate, it becomes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can also revert back to carbon dioxide and water. So these reactions are going forward and backward at roughly the same rate. We do have an enzyme in the red blood cells called carbonic anhydrase, which tries to speed up this reaction, speed up the conversion of CO2 and water into carbonic acid, though. All right, so here we are in the tissues. You can see a cell here is the source of CO2, produces it. It diffuses out into the blood capillary because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissue is 45 millimeters mercury. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood capillary is 40 millimeters mercury at the arterial end. Now, after the blood has had some time to pass through the capillaries and equilibrate with the tissues, you'll see at the venous end that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 millimeters mercury. All right. And so at the venous end of the capillaries, no matter what gas we're talking about, whether it's CO2 or oxygen, um, it will look like the composition of the tissue that it just passed through. Okay. So partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues was 40 millimeters mercury. At the venous end, partial pressure of oxygen will be 40 millimeters mercury in the blood. Partial pressure of CO2 in the tissues was 45 millimeters mercury.